Welcome to ComputerWorld Canada in Conversation. I have with me Howard Solomon, Assistant Editor of Network World. Howard, it has been a busy week in Ottawa on the Telecom front.
It's not merely been a busy week, Dave. It's been a busy month. We'll start earlier in the month when the CRTC held an extraordinary week-long hearing on whether it should order incumbent phone companies and cable companies to give access to their newest and highest speed networks to competitors like independent internet providers. Now, the ISPs argue they've got to have access to these fast new networks, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to offer competing speeds, and basically they'll be wiped out.
This was an unusually entertaining session by CRTC standards.
It was. A number of people got hot under the collar, including Michael Hennessy of TELUS, who said at one moment the debate was bullshit. He later told me he wasn't aiming that comment at the commission itself, but at an unnamed person who was making remarks. But what happened at the hearing was the phone companies and the cable companies took very hard positions, and they said there's no way we can allow competitors access to these networks. They said, first of all, it's a highly competitive industry between the phone companies and the cable companies. Look at all the competition that's going on. They said this is no longer the era of monopoly, when the phone companies had monopolies, and that's where regulation came in. There's no need for the CRTC to step in. The other thing was, this hearing was ordered by the cabinet, because the cabinet, because the CRTC earlier said that the incumbents had to give access to these high-speed networks. The cabinet said the CRTC should have taken greater consideration into whether or not allowing competitors on the networks would affect the investment plans of the incumbents. Well, of course, the incumbents look at this and say, well, of course, if that's the parameters of this hearing, then we can't, we're telling you, Commission, that it's really going to drastically affect our ability to invest. And essentially, they gave the Commission no wiggle room. So I think, frankly, the independent internet providers are in trouble on this one.
There's also a Senate report regarding how spectrum auction money should be spent.
Well, the Senate report was on whether Canada should have a digital strategy. And the government has already said what it wants to do is have Canada have a digital economy, and right now there's ongoing public discussions on this. The Senate's take was we should have a digital strategy, and they made a number of recommendations, one of which was, in order that the country be digital, we need to have a government policy to extend broadband to rural areas, to remote areas, what's called the digital divide between rural and urban. And one of the recommendations was that the government should take all of the money that it gets from spectrum auctions and give that in some ways to support the private sector to bring broadband to rural areas.
So a maverick plan which was immediately backpedaled upon.
The chairman of the committee, Liberal Senator Dennis Dawson, immediately said, hey, look, we made a mistake. The report is wrong. We shouldn't have said all of the money. What we meant to say is some of the money. And that's too bad, because that tarnishes that report a bit, which is very thoughtful And I think a lot of people should read this report because it takes a very interesting tact on how Canada should have a digital strategy for the future.
Yeah, I understand it doesn't approach it from the perspective of guaranteeing a certain speed of internet access to rural locations.
Right. There are some countries have said our strategy is going to be we guarantee 100 megabits per second to everybody within a certain number of years, or 10 megabits. This committee has said speed isn't important. What's important is we should decide what kinds of services, essential services from government and the health sector, people everywhere should be entitled to have access to. And then once we decide that, telecom providers should provide speeds to be able to get that. And that's a very interesting concept and certainly worth the public debating.
Yes, it certainly seems to focus on the application of the technology rather than the technology for technology's sake. And if that weren't enough, the industry committee report or reports on reforming foreign ownership regulations in telecom. Well,
Dave, foreign ownership in telecom has been on Parliament's mind at least 5 years. And the reason why it came to the fore most recently is when the CRTC and the Cabinet differed on whether Global Live Wireless, which is the parent of Wind Mobile, is Canadian controlled or not. The Commission said yes, the Cabinet overruled it, and that raised a whole bunch of questions on what is the government's policy on foreign telecom ownership, and how do we avoid this kind of battle between the regulator and the government. And so early this year, Industry Minister Tony Clement said he wants to open the doors to foreign ownership in the telecom industry. He didn't say specifically how. And then he tossed it to the Industry Committee of the House of Commons to come up with some recommendations. But then Mr. Clement kind of got ahead of the Industry Committee and with Cabinet's blessings introduced 3 options that he wants the public to look at. And then based on whichever one the public and the industry seems to prefer, he'll introduce legislation in the fall. Well, this week the Industry Committee weighed in and it made no recommendations, but essentially it split on party lines. So the 3 opposition parties said they want to see more debate. They don't want to see particular legislation, they want to see more discussion. And what that seems to me is to torpedo the 3 choices that the government wants to discuss and to kill any possibility that any legislation the government would bring forward in the fall would be passed.
And so do you think the federal government would back down on introducing legislation rather than make it a matter of confidence and possibly fall?
I'm not sure that they'd make it a confidence matter. What they may very well do is introduce legislation because they've already promised that they would, and then they'll kick it back to the Industry Committee and there'll be more hearings and more delays and it'll go nowhere.
Mm-hmm. This government does seem to be confrontational when it comes to particularly the CRTC.
I'm not quite sure what it wants. There are various signals that it's sending. On the one hand, it's telling the Commission ought to rely more on market forces and not on regulation. The interesting thing, though, is on wireless, the government stepped in, and it set aside spectrum strictly for new entrants so that new entrants could come in. there's an interference
interventionist policy, definitely,
in the private market, and one of the things it wants to do on foreign ownership is it wants to support those new entrants to make sure they're not wiped out by incumbents like Bell, Rogers, and Telus. And it wouldn't surprise me that in the next spectrum auction, the government is again going to set aside protection for new entrants, which again is interventionist.
Thanks a lot, Howard. Thank you for watching.